Malachi 1:1-5 opens the final prophetic book of the Old Testament by reminding Israel of God's unchanging covenant love. Although the people had returned from exile, disappointment and spiritual apathy had caused many to question whether God truly loved them. The Lord answered their doubts, not by appealing to their present circumstances, but by pointing them to his sovereign purpose throughout history. This passage establishes the foundation for everything that follows. God's faithfulness does not depend upon human performance, but upon his own covenant promise. Commentary on Malachi 1:1-5. Verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. The word translated burden refers to a weighty prophetic message. Malachi was entrusted with God's final recorded prophetic message before the coming of Christ. Though the message contains rebukes, its ultimate purpose is restoration. God speaks because he has not abandoned his covenant people. The prophecy is addressed to Israel, the covenant nation, through whom God had promised to bring the Messiah. Although the nation had returned from Babylonian captivity, many had become spiritually complacent. Their external worship continued, but their hearts had grown cold. Verse 2, I have loved you, saith the Lord. Yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? God begins with a declaration rather than a demand. Before correcting his people, he reminds them of his love. This love was not based upon Israel's obedience or worthiness, but upon his own gracious choice. The people's response reveals spiritual blindness. Because they measured God's love by their outward circumstances, they questioned what had always been true. Their hardships caused them to doubt his faithfulness. The Lord points them back to history rather than to their feelings. His love is demonstrated through his covenant faithfulness across generations. His promises never failed, even when his people often failed him. For believers, God's love reaches its fullest expression in Jesus Christ. Every promise made through Israel ultimately finds its fulfillment in him. His finished work reveals that God's acceptance rests entirely upon his faithfulness rather than human achievement. Verse 3, Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau. Jacob and Esau shared the same parents, yet God distinguished between them according to his sovereign purpose. The language of loving Jacob and hating Esau expresses covenant choice rather than personal hostility. God chose Jacob's family line as the one through whom his redemptive plan would unfold. Edom, the descendants of Esau, repeatedly opposed Israel throughout biblical history. Their continual resistance to God's covenant purposes eventually resulted in judgment. The emphasis of this passage is not on arbitrary favoritism, but on God's sovereign freedom to accomplish his purposes through his chosen covenant line. His plan was always directed toward bringing salvation into the world through the Messiah. Verse 4, Whereas Edom saith, We are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Edom believed it could rebuild what God had determined to bring down. Their confidence rested in human determination rather than humble submission to God's will. History confirmed God's declaration. The nation of Edom gradually disappeared, while God's covenant promises continued through Israel until they reached their fulfillment in Christ. This contrast illustrates that God's purposes cannot be overturned by human effort. What he establishes remains secure, and what he judges cannot ultimately endure. Verse 5, And your eyes shall see, and ye shall say, The Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel. God promises that Israel would eventually recognize his greatness. His glory would extend beyond the borders of the land because his covenant plan would reach the nations. The coming of Christ accomplished what Israel's history anticipated. Through his death, resurrection, and exaltation, God's salvation was proclaimed throughout the world. The covenant reached its intended goal as people from every nation were brought into God's family through faith. The judgment upon the old covenant order and the establishment of the everlasting kingdom demonstrated that God's promises had not failed. Instead, they had reached their intended completion exactly as he declared through his prophets. Summary. Malachi 1:1-5 reminds readers that God was grounded in his covenant faithfulness rather than human circumstances. Israel questioned his love because they focused on present difficulties, but God directed them to his unchanging purposes throughout history. Jacob and Esau illustrate God's sovereign plan unfolding through the covenant line that would ultimately bring forth the Messiah. Edom's downfall demonstrates the certainty of God's judgments, while Israel's preservation points to his unwavering promises. The passage ultimately directs attention to Jesus Christ, in whom God's covenant love, faithfulness, and redemptive purpose are fully revealed. God's promises were not left incomplete, but reached their fulfillment through the establishment of his everlasting kingdom, causing his name to be magnified among all nations.